see that different colleges have different outcomes, right? And so this is, we're talking about earnings, but you can also look at graduation rates, retention rates, and a whole host of other things. But this is important to highlight because before you choose a college, you should be making sure that this is a college that is likely going to be better for me in terms of my long-term outcomes, in terms of my salary, in terms of graduation rates, in terms of how much debt I'm going to leave with, and et cetera. So doing your research and planning ahead is extremely important, and that's going to be a theme of our presentation today. Okay, so long story short, financial aid and financial planning are extremely important. And I want you to reframe college from the financial frame, right? And you cannot afford to stay uninformed as a person in the US. And you have to understand that college is a financial investment, right? You are making a financial investment. This is not like high school where you just go to high school, hang out with your friends, go to class and move on, right? And typically, high school is subsidized for the most part in the US unless you go to a private school. But college is not necessarily like that. And so you have to recognize that this is a financial investment that you're making. And your parents are partners and need to be included in this process, right? Sometimes students want to do all this, especially in our community where maybe your parents weren't born here, they might be immigrants. And so you might say like, oh, they don't understand the process. They're just going to get more confused. Or maybe even your parents are pushing back and saying, you know what, I wasn't born here. I don't know how to deal with this. You deal with everything. That is unacceptable. You really have to include your parents as much as possible, whether it's you or them. You need to come to the table and have a conversation about finances and what's realistic in terms of paying for college. If you can avoid taking out loans, you definitely should. Again, we can put aside the Islamic point for just a second. Objectively speaking, taking out loans can be detrimental to your long-term financial health. Okay, so in terms of, there's examples we can share. I won't get into that just for the sake of time. But really, really important to stay informed and not allow yourself to kind of fall into this trap of ignorance is bliss, right? In this case, there can be devastating financial outcomes as a result of not being informed about the process. With that, we'll keep going. Let me pause for any, this was framing mostly, so let's jump in and then I'll pause for questions, inshallah. So, types of financial aid. And just to define what is financial aid. So financial aid is a way for you to help pay for college outside of your family savings or your personal savings, right? And most students will receive some form of financial aid, and parents making under $200,000 a year can still qualify. And so generally I tell students to, definitely apply for financial aid because you don't know necessarily how they calculate the formula for you to receive it. And so for example, your parents you could have a really good job, but then you are also, one of multiple siblings, your grandparents live with you, and there's all these other kind of factors that weigh in for how the financial aid is calculated, and so you may still come away with something, and so it is worth applying. And so we'll go over the general categories, and then I'll go into specifics of the actual financial aid forms. So in terms of the specific categories, first and foremost, we can categorize scholarships, right? And that can come from the college itself or independent organizations. And these are primarily determined by academics, your GPA, your SAT, extracurricular leadership involvements. And this is money you do not have to pay back, right? And so this is money that you were given for your college education that you do not have to pay back. And eligibility and size of the award varies by college or the organization providing the scholarship. And there's a bunch of resources that you can learn about for independent scholarships. FastWeb is one. Going Merry is actually a newer one that I recommend. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then the Islamic Scholarship Fund funds Muslim students specifically for specific majors. So not all students can apply for those. If you are studying an area that they kind of want to support, then you can apply. And the slides, the figures that I'm pulling from are actually from the Muslim College Guide that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, so you can read more about these there, inshallah. So the second category are grants, and these are determined entirely by financial need. And so scholarships are typically merit-based, grants are typically need-based, okay? And so determined entirely by financial need, and this is also money you do not have to pay back. And there's different types of grants. You can complete the FAFSA, which is the federal form we'll talk about, to receive Pell Grants from the federal government. When you complete the FAFSA, you'll typically be qualified, or your application will be sent through for state grants from the state government as well. And then there's also something called the CSS Profile for institutional aid. And so this is typically, well, again, we'll talk about this in a moment. but this is typically for colleges with deeper pockets and larger endowments. They can also provide need-based grants for students to attend their colleges. Then the third category are subsidized loans, and these are typically from the federal government. These are also determined by financial need through the FAFSA application, and these are loans that do not collect interest until the day you graduate. So these are, you do have to pay these back, right? The bad news here is that there are limited amounts of subsidized loans that you can borrow. And I'll say here, there are kind of workarounds you can do to delay the interest payments collecting at the end of your graduation. But typically, again, these are smaller amounts that you can borrow. So you can't just, take out all your college expenses with subsidized loans, for example. If you're eligible for these, they will be included in a financial aid award package. We'll go over a financial aid award letter at the end. And then there's a cool organization I'll highlight here called the Continuous Charity that started out in Michigan and is now a national organization that provides interest-free loans to Muslim students. Wonderful organization. Highly recommend you check them out. If you are applying to college right now, I believe their deadline is March 1st for this cycle. And so the application is open. Definitely, again, recommend you check them out. But you can get non-interest-based loans for your college education or graduate education from a continuous charity. And then the last category are unsubsidized loans. And these are also determined by financial need through the FAFSA or a private lender. And these are loans that collect interest from the day you receive them. These are what we would imagine are typical loans. And then we'll go over the smiley scale in just a moment. But there's basically various interest rates here. And so you have to be careful and understand what type of loan you're receiving when it comes to unsubsidized loans. Okay, so just some resources for independent grants and scholarships. I highly recommend QuestBridge if you're a low-income, high-achieving student. This is a national kind of scholarship opportunity that if you come from a low-income family but have good grades, you should definitely check them out. They have a really good process for you to match with competitive colleges, but also if you get accepted, you'll be guaranteed 4 years of tuition paid for. So check out QuestBridge if you qualify. And then I mentioned Going Merry. This is for independent scholarships. What they've essentially tried to do is aggregate a bunch of independent scholarships into one platform. You have one application that you fill out, and then that one application can go to multiple scholarships. And so it's a more efficient way of applying for scholarships. So check them out as well. And then Muslim specific, ISNA has some scholarships listed on their website that you can check out. The Islamic Scholarship Foundation I mentioned, and then a continuous charity again, interest-free loans that you can get access to. Okay, let me pause here for just a second if there are any questions.
Yeah, so there is one question that kind of correlates to this. Are there any academic requirements or other conditions for the renewal of your financial aid, including scholarships and grants? Or does it apply for all 4 years?
Yeah, great question. So for scholarships, typically there will be GPA cutoffs. So you have to maintain a certain level of GPA to maintain the scholarship from year to year. So that's a great question. In terms of grants, there are typically no GPA requirements, but there will be income requirements. And so let's say 1 year your parent makes less money, and so you qualify for some level of Pell Grants, and then the next year they make more money. You'll likely reduce the amount of Pell Grants that you'll get access to. And so you'll file this form every single year. And these will be the FAFSA is basically going to be based off of your tax information. And so depending on how your tax information shifts, you may have different amounts of grants or subsidized loans from year to year. Good question.
And one more question that you kind of already hit on a little bit. Does financial aid adjust if tuition is adjusted? So I know you talked about salary and income, but what happens if tuition is adjusted for the college or university?
Yeah, I think that's probably a less likely scenario. But for the federal grants and loans, at least subsidized loans and the Pell Grant specifically, there are typically maximum amounts that you can receive. And so even if the tuition rate adjusts, it probably, unless it goes down significantly, you probably would get the same amount regardless. So if the college becomes more expensive from year to year, these two probably won't change. And then scholarships likely won't change either, actually, because it's basically an upfront guarantee for a set amount of money that they're going to pay. So when you get accepted to a college, you probably hear back in April. by May, June, you should be getting a financial aid award letter that tells you how much scholarship money you received, how much Pell Grants you received, and you should have a sense of how much you're going to be expected to pay or not pay for college. And then you can make a decision when you see all the different financial aid award letters from the different colleges you apply to. Good question. Okay. Any other questions?
Nope, all good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The other piece here that I'll just mention briefly are savings. Obviously, you can save for college. And, again, you should talk to your parents if you haven't already, if you're in high school, about how much money they can contribute to your college education, if any. And then also you can get a part-time job in high school. I highly recommend that. It's great for your resume in terms of developing your own sense of, identity and having something to talk about in your college essays. But it can also help save a lot of money for college. And so you can save a few thousand in the summer if you work a summer job or throughout the school year. So that's something you should think about. Again, talk to your family about what's realistic, what's feasible. Unfortunately, a lot of times we don't talk to our families or we don't have these conversations, and then senior year you get these, potential bills and you're like, what am I going to do? So you don't want to be in that position. So preparation is key here. So again, saving up money from beforehand is a great plan. The second, which are somewhat popular, are 529 college savings plans. And so these are tax-advantaged accounts designed specifically for educational savings. What I would say here is that if you are a wealthier family, it makes a lot of sense to contribute to these because there's a lot of tax benefits for doing this. You can think of this as like a Roth IRA if you're familiar with investment vehicles, but for education. So if your family is like not as tax savvy or isn't familiar with these sort of tools, I generally don't recommend them because they can, number one, if you withdraw from them and use money that you contribute for college education for something else, there's a huge penalty that you're going to be basically charged. And basically, instead of just having a checking account that's maybe specific to college where you can withdraw from freely, this one is going to penalize you quite a bit. So if you're a middle income family or a lower income family, I would just be cautious and make sure you do your research and really understand what you're doing when you open up a 529 college savings plan. And their 529 plans can count against your financial aid. And so if you're a middle income family that would have qualified for some level of financial aid, but then you saved up some money in a 529 plan, again, these are like registered with the state, so they understand how much money you have. It can count against your financial aid and you basically won't qualify for financial aid. So here I would, definitely consult a tax professional, learn more about it, fully understand what you're doing before you commit with those. Okay. So now applying for financial aid specifically. So the first is the FAFSA, then you have state financial aid forms, then you have the CSS profile, and then in some cases there are institutional forms as well. So we'll break down each one of these. So the FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. Okay, and so the first word is free, right? No one should. Sometimes there are these folks like independent counselors who might come to you and say, "Hey, I'll help you with the FAFSA application. I'm going to charge you X amount of money to fill it out for you." There's no reason to do that, right? You are all competent enough and intelligent enough to fill this out on your own. There's no real way to game this application to get more rewards. It's all based on your tax records. And so unless you're gaming your tax records, there's nothing really that's going to change in terms of your FAFSA. And so don't fall for these gimmicks. So it's totally free. So this opens up October 1st of your senior year. It is distributed and managed by the federal/national government. It's based on your tax returns, and you have to answer questions about your income, your savings, and household size. At the end of you filling out this form, it should take about 20 minutes. And there are tools now for you to even connect this directly to the IRS so that you can pull your tax records. And so it's becoming easier and easier to apply. They just passed legislation with the American Recovery Act, with the COVID Act, to actually shorten the FAFSA from over 100 questions to about 35. And so it's getting easier and easier for you to apply for this. So number one, you should be applying for it, even if you think you may not qualify. And then number two, you should not be paying anyone to fill this out. This is something you should fill out on your own. Okay. So at the end of the form, you receive something called an expected family contribution. This is your EFC number. And this is basically how much the FAFSA form or their algorithm expects for you to pay for college. This is the amount of money that you can contribute to your college education. And so, yeah, this is the amount of your parents or you can contribute to your college education, excuse me. And basically, this will provide you with some, depending on what you qualify for, it'll provide you with some assortment of Pell Grants, subsidized loans, unsubsidized loans, work study, which basically is you working on the college campus in like the library or admissions office or wherever, and you receiving some sort of payment that's guaranteed, and then plus loans as well. And if you can get up to $7,000 a year in Pell Grants if you're eligible. And so this is free money, again, that you do not have to pay back to your college education. Now, importantly, you might be a low-income student who has good grades, and so you could actually get scholarship money, merit-based scholarship money, and Pell Grant money for being financially in financial need. And so you could potentially, with both of those, cover your full cost of tuition and or get paid to go to college, because let's say your merit-based scholarship pays for your college education and your tuition. The Pell Grants would cover additional costs like commuting to college or buying textbooks or things like that. And so there are students, if you have high grades and you're in need, you can actually get paid to go to college, which is very cool. So all the more reason for you to have good grades and qualify for merit-based scholarships. Okay. And you can do a free test run. There's something called the Federal Student Aid Estimator, so you can use that website right now, do like a trial run of what your EFC number might be and get a sense of how much you might be expected to contribute to your college education. Okay, so these are just some FAFSA screenshots from the website. You can see that they ask for student demographic information, what schools you're applying to, what your dependency status is. Most students are going to be, you can look at the criteria here, but most students are going to be dependent on their parents from a tax perspective. Then they ask about your parents, then their parent financials, your financials, and then you submit the form. Together, this should take, if you have your tax records on hand, this should take no more than 30 minutes for you to fill out. And then when you fill out the FAFSA form the next year, because you have to fill it out every single year you're going to college, if you qualify for financial aid, it'll be easier and easier for you to reapply year after year. And then if you have siblings applying to college, they can also use your information and pull your information, so you don't have to fill out everything all over again. So it is a fairly straightforward form. You should be filling it out if you're going to college. Okay. And just to get a sense of the different loans and Pell Grants you can receive, again, this is in the Muslim College Guide, check it out. But for Pell Grants, there's no interest rate, right? Again, these are grants that you do not have to pay back. These are wonderful, these are great. Direct subsidized loans, there's a much lower interest rate. And again, the interest does not collect until the day you graduate. And so, arguably these are much better. Then you have unsubsidized loans, which again, these are typical loans. The difference here is that they just have lower interest rates, right? These collect interest the day you graduate. Then you have Perkins and Federal Plus loans, which have higher interest rates. And basically, as you go down this scale, you basically get access to more money, right? And so these are more limited in terms of what they provide for you, because they're either the interest is being paid off by the federal government, / you're not paying it until you graduate, or it's just a lower interest rate initially. And so these tend to be better than these two. And then obviously there's another category you can imagine here, which is private lenders, which have even higher interest rates, and those you should really be cautious about. Okay. So I just did some, basic calculations here just to show how interest works, right? So let's say on average, we said that $30,000 students graduate from their undergraduate institution with $30,000 in student loans. Let's assume a 4.6% interest rate. You have some combination of, the loans that we mentioned before. If you take 10 years to pay it off with a monthly payment of $313, you'll have paid about $37,000 or 25% more than the initial amount you borrowed, right? And so because of the interest that's collecting, you're basically paying $7,500 more than you initially borrowed. If you take longer to pay it off, let's say 20 years, you're going to be paying $46,000 instead of that initial $30,000, or 50% more than the initial amount you borrowed, right? And so essentially what I'm just doing here is showing you how interest compounds over time, right? And so for graduate school, the average is about $83,000 in student loans if you do a master's or above. And they typically have higher interest rates because they typically have higher interest rates. I'll leave it at that. And here again, you're seeing that by the 10 years, if it takes you 10 years to pay it off, which I would say is fairly quickly relative to the average, you're basically paying a huge premium in terms of the amount relative to the amount you initially borrowed, right? And so it's just important to understand that the point of interest is that it makes money for the lender, right? And so you're going to be spending a lot more money than you initially borrowed by taking out these loans. Okay. All right. Then we have state financial aid forms. There's typically a higher education state authority in your state that handles state financial aid. These are only for residents of that state and universities and this typically only applies to universities within those specific states. And so if I live in New Jersey and I go to college in Pennsylvania, I will typically not be qualified for state financial aid, right? And vice versa. So if you're crossing state borders, you're unlikely to qualify for state financial aid. So typically a FAFSA application will automatically qualify you for state financial aid form. So there's typically no separate form that you have to fill out. If for some reason you might be undocumented or there's some sort of specific situation that applies to you, then you may not qualify to fill out the FAFSA, right, the federal form, because you're undocumented. And so some states will allow you to fill out their state financial aid, or they'll have a separate state financial aid form for you to fill out so you can qualify for some level of state aid. This varies from state to state. Obviously, these are also exceptional circumstances for certain people. But typically, if you fill out the FAFSA, you'll automatically qualify for state financial aid. Okay? And then financial aid here typically includes grants and some loans as well. And so states do typically provide some level of additional grants in addition to the federal Pell grants. Okay? So you can get grants from state financial aid as well, which is great. All right? And then you have the CSS Profile and institutional forms. So the CSS Profile stands for the College Scholarship Service. And this also opens October 1st. And it's administered by the College Board, the same organization that administers AP tests and the SAT. And typically only colleges with deeper pockets use the CSS Profile. And so this is basically for colleges with larger endowments or typically private colleges that can pay you to attend their university if you get in, right? And so the challenge here is that the CSS Profile is an additional form you have to fill out. And a lot of times school counselors may not even remind you to fill these out, right? And so if you're applying to more selective colleges, you should definitely check if they are listed if they have a CSS Profile that you can submit to see if you qualify for additional financial aid from those institutions, right? And this is based entirely on financial need, just like the FAFSA. It's not looking at your GPA, not looking at your SAT scores, not looking at your leadership and extracurricular activities. One thing that people do find maybe frustrating is that it does go deeper into your family's finances than the FAFSA. And then you have to pay for this, which is, somewhat silly if you think about being in financial need and then having to pay to apply for financial aid. But there is a cost associated, unfortunately, that varies from year to year. But again, if you're applying to more selective colleges and you think you have a shot at getting into those because you have a really good GPA, you have a good SAT score, you should definitely consider looking at what colleges are listed on the CSS Profile and then seeing if you can apply to this and get access to more financial aid. And this is typically very generous if you qualify and get admitted. Okay? And then you have institutional forms, and these are colleges that don't want to use the CSS Profile but still provide institutional aid. So Princeton very famously, has their own institutional form. They opted out of the CSS Profile and it's totally free to apply. Right? And so you don't have to pay for it because Princeton wants to provide it for free for families who might qualify. Okay? So basically at the end of senior year, now you've applied, or at this point in your senior, if you're in your senior year right now, you should have finished your college applications and now you should be focusing on your financial aid forms, right? And so you have to fill out the FAFSA and then if possible, and if you're applying to more selective colleges, the CSS Profile as well. Okay? And let's just do a quick overview of what a financial aid award letter looks like. So now I've applied to college, I got accepted to a few places, I submitted my FAFSA, I submitted my CSS Profile, and this is what I get back, right? So basically, they'll tell you something like this is your financial aid, this is how much you got in grants and scholarships. So you got the faculty scholarship, which equals about $31,000 for a year. I got the Pell Grant for about $2,600 a year. Again, this is money I don't have to pay back. There's another grant which I was qualified for. This is a much smaller grant, but I got $800 from that per year. And then these are the loan amounts. Now, just because the loans are listed here does not mean you have to take them. That's an important distinction I should have made earlier. So a lot of Muslim families specifically freak out when they see loans right on the letter. That doesn't mean you have to take them out. You can opt out of those loans. You can opt out of any of these options here. So typically there'll be a button to say like, okay, I opt out of the loans, I opt out of this, etc. But this is just telling you how much you qualified for. So you qualified for some level of subsidized loans, about $3,500, unsubsidized loans, about $2,000. So altogether, this is roughly $40,000 a year that you've gotten in financial aid to go to college. Now, at the same time, though, the cost of attending that college is $61,000 a year between tuition, fees, housing, meal plans, and then indirect costs. These, they're not going to charge you these up front. These are just estimates of what they cost, but around, let's say, $59,000 here, and you're getting about $40,000. So your total estimated balance that you would owe on a regular basis is about $21,000. And so you can, again, talk to your parents and see, okay, is this feasible? Maybe they can afford to pay that over 4 years. Maybe not. And then at this point, what you have to recognize is you've exhausted the federal loans. And so you can apply for like the federal plus loans that I mentioned before, which typically have greater amounts that you can borrow from to cover this cost. But again, those are higher interest, right? And so now, if this is the cost of your college, we're talking about $80,000. So now you're starting at a much higher rate than the average $30,000 a year. Okay? And so just want to break that down. I hope that was helpful. Hopefully you guys followed along. But this is really important to understand before you sign up to a college or enroll in a college. Okay, let's do one more example. This is another, example of the email you might get or the letter you might get from the college. Again, estimated cost of attendance, tuition and fees, some breakdown, and then a summary of what you earned in financial aid and scholarship. And so this person got the President's Scholarship, again, Pell Grants, that SEOG. Then they also got some state scholarships, which is great. And then they got some federal package here of loans, subsidized, unsubsidized, Perkins loan, and then work study. Okay, but again, there's a difference here between the cost of attendance and the actual amount of financial aid they received. Okay, so it's really, really important that you understand these letters before you commit to a college. Okay, let me pause there. I think we're almost close. Oh, actually, we're at the end. So let me just finish up, and then we can open up for Q&A. Again, so in summary, a lot of what I talked about is actually in the Muslim College Guide. Check it out, download it. If you go to a public school, share it with your school counselor so they can share it with other Muslim students that they might work with. If you have other family or friends who might be applying to college, share it with them. There's a ton of really great insight and resources. There are a lot of great insights and resources in this guide from chaplains, from higher ed staff, and from experts about how to choose the best college for you. Again, this is a financial investment that you're making, so you want to stay educated, you want to stay on top of it. Don't be a bystander to the decisions that you're making about your life, right? Be active, understand, research, prepare. And again, the Muslim Campus Index is another really great resource. If you're a college student, help us, crowdsource more information here. You can fill out the form for your college. Let us know what resources they have. We'll put it up on the website. If you're a high school student, again, share this with your friends and family to get a better sense of what resources are available for Muslim students. So with that, I will conclude and I will open it up for questions.
Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Salman, for the very informative presentation. So like he mentioned, the two links are put in the chats on the LinkedIn Live as well as the YouTube Live. So feel free to click on them and, look into it over there. So we'll open it up for QA now. So we can, we do have a couple of questions. So if you guys have any questions you guys would like to ask, again, feel free to add them onto the chat. But we'll start with some of the questions that we have here. So some general ones. Do you recommend any good websites to find scholarships or grants you can get outside of the FAFSA?
Yeah, great question. So FAFSA, definitely, again, like I said, apply for that. CSS Profile, if you're applying to more selective colleges, you want to fill that out as well. And then there's a bunch of independent scholarships that you can find, right? Like it's an overwhelming amount. I recommend starting with Going Merry, the one I mentioned. That's kind of like what they're trying to do is be the common app for scholarships. And so you fill out one application and then you can send it out to multiple scholarships. So that's a good place to start. There's FastWeb. And then there might even be local community scholarships that you don't even know about. So look in your local community. Those are obviously going to be less competitive. And so maybe you have a higher chance of getting them. And then the Islamic Scholarships Fund, ISF, that's a great resource. And then a continuous charity for non-interest-based loans is also really great.
All right, Jazakallah. Here's another good question. Is there an appeal process once I receive my financial aid?
Yes, good question. Great question. So this is the benefit of applying to multiple colleges, right? And so let's say I'm University of, let's say I'm Rutgers University, right, in New Jersey. If you get accepted to a competitor to Rutgers University, let's say Penn State, right, both state schools, really good state schools, both close together, I can go to Rutgers and say, hey, I really love Rutgers. You know, I grew up in New Jersey. I have a connection to this community. I got X amount of money from Penn State, but you only gave me Y amount, which isn't as much. Is there any way you can match what Penn State gave me so that I can come to Rutgers? That is very common practice, and financial aid offices are, I want to say expecting you to do that, but they are open to you doing that, right? And so you can definitely leverage different offers that you get to raise a current offer that you have that you really want to go to. Now, this only works for peer institutions, right? So if I get into, you know, some fancy school, let's say in Texas, Rice University, right, is like one of the best schools in the state. And then I'm trying to compete with UT Dallas. They're probably like, well, you know, UT Dallas isn't a peer institution to Rice. And so we're not going to really think about that. But then if you say Rice to Stanford or something like that, then they might compete. So assuming you get into peer institutions, right, colleges that kind of like look at each other as competitors, you can definitely leverage the financial aid offers and scholarship offers that you get against each other. And colleges are not going to be thrown off. You might be nervous about it. You might feel like, oh man, I can't do this, or this isn't right, or I'm not supposed to, you know, ask questions here. But no, you should definitely do it. And it's something that they're used to. They're not going to be surprised, like, oh my God, how could you even ask that? They're going to be like, oh man, okay, this guy did his research. You know, all right, let's see what we can do.
Okay, perfect. Another question. What happens if I accidentally put in the wrong numbers in my FAFSA? Will I be able to correct them, or will this affect my financial aid in any way?
Yeah, so you can submit a correction form. What I would say is try not to do that, right? Like that's just going to be a headache. So be careful. You're filling out a federal form. You don't want to just do it with your eyes closed or half asleep. Like make sure the information is correct. Double check it. Again, you're going to be looking at your tax records to fill out the information. And so, you know, really make sure that it's filled out correctly before you submit it, because you don't want to have to deal with that.
Okay, this one's more of a confirmation question. Do we have to apply to both, or does the FAFSA automatically apply you for state financial aid if applicable?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so typically, again, unless you fall into some special category of being like undocumented or some other circumstance, if you fill out the FAFSA form, it should qualify you automatically for state financial aid. Double check your state depending on where you live. I know most states, it's automatic. So if you fill out the FAFSA, you're automatically, that information, the federal government just sends it to your state government, and you automatically will have state access to financial aid. But again, if there's like a qualifying situation, you might have to apply separately. Or you probably won't even apply for in the case of being undocumented, for example, you can't qualify for the FAFSA. And so you would just apply directly for your state aid if it's available in your state.
Okay, here's one more. Will financial aid differ based on my living situation? I am a commuter, but would it change if I was living on campus or off campus, for example?
Yeah, good question. They do ask you if you're going to live on campus versus off campus. And so it may affect your financial aid. What I would do there is just try to understand, like if you're on a commuter campus and you're most likely going to commute, just, you know, be honest about that. Yeah. And then, I mean, this opens up another question of like, you know, independent versus dependent. So if you're independent, and that means that you're not dependent on your parents, right? And so again, most of the time it's in, you know, specific circumstances where a child is like estranged from the parents or something, or living separately for whatever reason. In those cases, you typically will qualify for more financial aid. But yeah, so it depends on your circumstance for sure. But what I would tell you is just be honest about what your circumstances are.
Okay. A lot of people have been asking this. I'll kind of try to generalize this. How does loan forgiveness work? Is that done through the school, or would that be done through any other federal entities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, all the college students are asking that. So in terms of loan forgiveness, it's typically done through the federal government, right? So like the Biden plan that's happening now, that is going to be done through the federal government. You're going to have to apply for it. go through the federal process and then get that forgiven. If you do, there are programs, I can't remember the names right now, but for example, if you go to college, you have loans, and then you go into teaching, for example, or a service job at a nonprofit. If you stay in that job for 10 years, you can qualify for some level of loan forgiveness as well. And that's typically arranged through the borrower. So if you borrowed from the federal government, then you're going to have to fill out some sort of form or communications with the federal government to apply for that. So typically loan forgiveness, yeah, that's a good way of framing it. The loan forgiveness is done through the borrower. So if you're borrowing from the federal government, it's going to be from the federal government, right?
Okay. Here's another one. Is financial aid affected if I do early action or early decision when applying for college?
Yeah, that's a good question. So financial aid will not typically be affected if you apply because financial aid is based on need, right? But if you apply early action to a state university, for example, that may affect your scholarship, right? Because the scholarship is based on merit typically, but if they know that you're committed to their university, they might provide you with less scholarship because they know they can use it to attract a different student. Does that make sense? So financial aid is based on need, right? It's based objectively on your financial situation. So that isn't typically, I would say, like gamed, right? In terms of how they provide that out to students. But scholarship might be, because scholarship you can think about as being a way for to attract high achieving students to a university. But if I already know that you're committed to my university, why am I incentivized to give you that much more money, right? So they might give you some level of scholarship, but maybe not as much. But so that's not a reason not to apply early, though. If you really have a dream school in mind and you want to apply early to it, I think you should.
Okay, perfect. Jazakallah. So we have a couple of more questions. And like I said, if anyone does have any more questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat and we will get to them, inshallah. Here we go. As a parent, is there anything I can do to maximize the amounts of financial aid that my child can get?
I mean, I don't want to answer any gaming questions necessarily, right? I think in our community, there are a lot of cash businesses and, sometimes families don't necessarily report all their income or whatever. So obviously that, if you're reporting less income on your tax form, then your overall income looks lower and you could potentially qualify for more financial aid. Outside of that sort of conversation, which, I don't really want to touch, I think the main thing you can do is, number one, talk to your child about your ability to contribute to their college education. Every family is in a different place. Some families can contribute, some families can't. Maybe some families can contribute something, right? Have that conversation early on with your child, number one. And if you're the child and your parents aren't here, talk to them about it. Hey, I'm really, really interested in studying X. And this, university has the best program for that in our area. I really want to go there. The challenge is it costs X amount of money. I don't know if, loans and grants will cover that. How can you help me kind of make a plan for us to pay that off? I'll get a part-time job. Maybe you can put about this amount of money away every month or every year towards a separate college account that we have, right? And then go from there. So number one is plan with your child, be a part of that conversation with them. And then second, I would say is make sure your tax records are, make sure your taxes are done every year on a timely basis so that they can use those records to fill out the FAFSA and everything. If parents are filling out their tax forms late, this used to happen more in my day before. I think in 2017, they amended the policy so you could use your tax forms from 2 years ago, but it used to be the case that you have to use last year's tax records. And so if your parents are filling out their taxes in April, I can't apply for financial aid until those tax forms are done. Right. And so making sure your tax records are in order and easy to access are going to be important.
Okay, perfect. Jazakallah. This kind of came into something that you quickly mentioned. Does work study have to be included in your financial aid package or can you apply separately?
Okay, so work study is like a federal program where the federal government is basically telling the college, hey, give that kid a job, right? When they go to campus. So you can opt out of it if you don't want to do that job. And when you're on campus, you can still apply to jobs normally, like you would any other job. This is like a federally guaranteed job, if that makes sense. Some people actually don't like work study because they feel like the hourly rate actually can come out lower than maybe what you can get outside of that. And so I think it depends on what you're looking for. I think maybe your first year, it makes sense to get federal work study if you want to get that, so you can get work experience and you have a guaranteed a guaranteed way of getting work experience. And then if you want to get a job outside of that, I think you can totally explore. But you don't have to do it. You can totally opt out if you want to.
Okay. Sounds good. So these are kind of two more general questions that you kind of hit on in your slides, but more of like just confirmation. Can you take out loans from outside of your college, a bank or a private loaner, for example?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can definitely find private lenders, and there's a whole market of them, right? Going back to the first slide I showed, you can see the average, the outstanding student loan debt is just increasing year after year after year, right? And so there's definitely private lenders. What I would say is be very careful. One of the reasons why it's better, if you're going to take out loans, it's better to go through the federal government is because there are barriers in place in terms of, protecting you from high interest rates and predatory behavior, right? But definitely be cautious about that if you can. And then, honestly, like what a continuous charity is doing, right? The nonprofit, Sadaqah Jariyah, right? The Muslim nonprofit, what they're doing is providing non-interest based loans, but they're basically getting that money from the community, right? And so if you can talk to your parents, maybe have uncles, friends, if you can crowdsource the funds to go to college, that's not a bad idea, right? And obviously pay them back when you get a job.
Okay. And last question, does interest rate depend on how much money you are given?
No, interest rate is based off of like what the lender says they want collected, right, on a regular basis. And so the interest rate could be, it could be whatever it is. It's totally dependent on the lender. So, but that's where you see private lenders will typically have higher interest rates than the government will, right? And that's one of the benefits of using the government. Just to go back a second on the early action question, that was a good question. It depends on the college too, so just double check with the college in terms of whether or not that might take away from your financial aid or scholarship, or specifically your scholarship. So just want to clarify that.
Okay, and one last question just jumped in. Would you be able to reiterate on the Islamic scholarship and loan opportunities?
Yeah, so check out Islamic Scholarship Fund. They are a nonprofit that provides Muslim students with scholarships, but for specific fields, right, where they feel Muslims are underrepresented. So a lot of their, scholarships are for like art or media jobs, media programs, or law school, for example. So they do have undergrad and graduate. That's a great, program. I definitely recommend you guys check it out. And then a continuous charity is a nonprofit, like I said, based out of Michigan. That's now national. That provides interest-free loans. And I think YM, YM members would be great candidates. A lot, they do screen for involvement in the community, good grades, having good recommendations and that sort of thing. So I think a lot of YM kids would actually be great candidates. So that I think closes March 1st. So you have about a week or two to apply. If you're in your senior year, definitely check them out. They do graduate school as well, and undergrad, so check them out.
Okay, perfect. That is it in terms of all the questions we have. Is there anything you would like to say to, end off or conclude?
Yeah, I think, again, be an active participant. This is your life. You are, you should really view this time in high school and college as you transitioning into adulthood, right? And a lot of times maybe we don't recognize that this is what's happening, but that's exactly what this is supposed to be. And so you need to be in the driver's seat of your life, making sure that you're getting good grades, not because your parents tell you to, not because your teacher tells you to, but because you recognize, number one, that this is going to open up doors for you in terms of the colleges you can get accepted to. But even in terms of the ROI, if you think about it from a financial perspective, you doing well in your SATs can lead to you getting over $80,000 in scholarship money, right? So study for the SATs thinking about that, right? Not just that your parents are bothering you about it or whatever it might be. So this is a financial, again, investment that you're making in your future. And so the more prepared you are, the better off you'll be. There's horror stories after horror story that we can share from Muslim families. I know YM members actually who've gone through, pretty bad situations in terms of not planning appropriately for the financial aid process or just the cost of college, and that's had detrimental effects on their long-term outcomes in terms of getting married, like we said, being able to buy a home, being able to save up for retirement, and so on and so forth. So be active, take responsibility of this process, talk to your parents, engage them, and definitely stay involved and engaged.
Okay, perfect. On that note, once again, Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Salman, for taking the time on a work day to talk to us and give us all this information. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that any brother or sister that is watching this now or will watch this in the future will be able to benefit from the information that was provided. On that note, the link to Muslim Campus Life is included in the chat, as well as a feedback form for our event. We encourage you to fill that out if you guys have any thoughts on, the event, or anything we can do to provide you guys with more beneficial information or events in the future, inshallah. On that note, we will end on behalf of the YM Professional Development Team. Jazakumullah khairan again. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله